Hello and welcome. It's good morning from me, but I know for many of you it's going to be good afternoon, and for at least one of us it's already good evening. But in any case, wherever you are, welcome to our webinar on blue carbon finance for developing coastal resilience. This is an important topic that some of us have been working on and thinking about for some time. Our journey, in a sense, started early last year when we had a meeting in Mauritius, which was designed around thinking about some of the impediments, some of the challenges to scaling up and implementing the sorts of solutions that we want to implement for climate mitigation, for enhancing livelihoods, for improving disaster risk reduction, and for a whole host of other benefits. How do we get there? Well, one of the impediments is implementing the finance to enable us to do the activities. We can get some of it from the public funds, but we can't get all of it. So there are some challenges to working out how to proceed, and some of us have been thinking about that. And to help us on that journey, we've got three thinkers that will talk to us a little bit about how they're approaching it from their perspectives. So I'm looking forward to their presentations and their subsequent discussions. So how we're going to implement it is I'll be the moderator for the day. My name is Matt Vanderklift. I'm based in Perth in Western Australia, where one of my roles is as director of the Indian Ocean Rim Association Blue Carbon Hub. So I will moderate the presentations and then the ensuing conversation. For the conversation, please post your questions at any time using the Q&A button, which probably will appear at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the presentations, I'll select from among those questions and throw them to our presenters. At any time, you can also use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves, to introduce yourselves, and generally have a conversation. But for your questions to the speaker, please use the Q&A function. So without any more from me, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, Dr. Andreas Hutahaean, who is the Deputy Director for Marine Conservation Management and Small Island Utilisation at the Coordinating Ministry for Maritime Affairs and Investment in Indonesia. Andreas is also the focal point for IORA Blue Economy activities in Indonesia, and Andreas has an extensive record and extensive experience in coastal research, working as a scientist and researcher, and also did his PhD at the University of Nagoya in Japan. And now Andreas works quite extensively on not just the research, but also implementation through policy. And I've had the privilege of working with Andreas on a few aspects, not only in Indonesia, but around the Indian Ocean for a number of years now. And I always value the insights Andreas brings. So please, Andreas, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Matt, for give me an opportunity to have a good meeting this morning in Jakarta time and also evening in US time. And I would like to share my screen if, yeah. I'm trying to stick on the time, and yeah, let me see. So I would like to give some information regarding some updates regarding the blue carbon issue in Indonesia, and also global regarding to the financial aspect. I think most of us already know that last night in Indonesia time, or we got surprised that some of the person on climate change issue got a Nobel Prize on physics. I think their contribution, one of the reasons why we are sitting here to discuss about the impact of CO2 due to the human emission, and what is the impact and how to mitigate the impact of to the human or to the humanity in global wide. So these are the important person who get the Nobel Prize last night. So starting from the importance of the why we sitting here, I think basically because we are care about the what is the blue economy is. I think it's the terminology that we use usually how we use our resources in ocean or in the coastal environment to improve our livelihood, provide the job, and also in the same time preserving our health to the ocean ecosystem. So based on the OECD database, we found that the value of the global ocean economy is about 1.5 trillion a year. So it's expecting becoming double in 2030. So I think this is why the important issue that we are thinking about what is the importance of the vulnerability of the resilience of our coastal ecosystem, because they are provide so many services to our life, not only because of the climate change issue, but also because of the food, energy, health, leisure, transportation, and so on. So on the right side, I think you can see the nature solution-based enhanced coastal resilience. So the figure one, I think this is get the information from the Ocean Panel for Ocean Sustainability. There is data from CSIRO describe the changes of the coastal ecosystem due to many reasons. In this aspect, let's think to the seagrass or mangrove and coral reef or other things in the important thing ecosystem in the coastal environment. So like mangrove, I think we found here the recent loss is about on average 0.1 per year, something like that. So most of the the changes of the coastal ecosystem of mangrove ecosystem is located in the marine protected area. It's about 43%. Unless similar to the seagrass, the average loss is about 2 to 7% per year, and 29%, 26% is located in the marine protected area. So I think marine protected area is now an dangerous situation because many degradation of coastal ecosystem that provide us so many services are continue to decline in this marine protected area or the national park, something like that. On the left side, I think I would like to share the information that this is just published last week, I think on 28 September 2021, that the strong commitment from our president, I think now the current government have a program to improve the resilience of the coastal ecosystem to restoration of mangrove ecosystem as well as the coral reef ecosystem. So as for mangrove ecosystem, we already plan to restore about 600,000 hectares until 2024. So in all over the countries, the area in Indonesia. So it's starting from this year for some 1,000 hectares, and this is telling us that why the coastal ecosystem is very important, and our government 100% support this idea of improving the resilience of the coastal community as well as the ecosystem. Comes to the global mangrove, I think most of us familiar with this information. On the right side, we found that the national carbon mangrove profile is about 23% in Indonesia, and it's about 3.48 million hectare of mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia, and about 2.3 is in a good condition, and 1.1 is under risk condition. So I think we need to consider, although we are thinking about doing some rehabilitation about 600,000, but it's already half of the risk condition of the mangrove ecosystem in Indonesia. So we are hoping we could able to not only to rehabilitate the mangrove ecosystem, but as well as to prevent the continued degradation of the mangrove ecosystem as well as other coastal ecosystem in Indonesia. This data coming from the Ministry of Environmental and Forestry Indonesia 2019. So let's come to the blue carbon. I think most of us already understand that what is blue carbon is the carbon capture or sequestration by the ocean or coastal vegetation through the process called photosynthetic. So they are taking up the CO2 and change to the O2 and carbohydrate or sugar, something like that. So there are several coastal vegetation that are important for in terms of the blue carbon framework. It's like in the open ocean, there are phytoplankton. In the coastal, there are seagrasses, macroalgae, mangrove, salt marsh, seaweed, and other plants in the coastal ecosystem. So below, we can see that the distribution of the seagrass, tidal marsh, and mangrove driven by Pendleton in 2012 done, and from their figures, I think we can see that most of the mangrove or seagrass ecosystem are located in the tropical environment, and then salt marsh in the subtropical environment. So, and also in the left side, I think this is the data coming from the UNEP and also from Marcidieti 2019. Then those information describe the value of our ecosystem services of mangrove, seagrass, and other things. So in this aspect, I think the mangrove is still the highest contribution in terms of services. Value of the services per hectare is about 91,000 US dollar, and well, seagrass is about 12,000 US dollar. So why is coastal ecosystem give the high efficiency of CO2 concentration sequestration? I think this is the reason. Very famous data from McLeod from TNC. I think she was the person who write this good information, and also other publication also telling us the important aspect of how is the blue carbon ecosystem being uptaken in the mangrove ecosystem, seagrass in Indonesia. These are some of the publication already regarding this issue. And back to our tropical forest, I think this is quite surprise when we are some time ago we are thinking about the importance of blue carbon, and we are sure that the tropical forest is the heart of our earth. But some from the last summer data, we found this kind of publication that the largest tropical forest like Amazon now is emitting more CO2 than what it should be supposed to be absorb the CO2. So this is I think we need to consider or to improve to enhance the importance of the blue carbon ecosystem, and as well as the same time we need to repair or to rehabilitate the tropical forest so that they can work based on their function to absorb CO2 and provide the oxygen to our livelihood. And based on this information, I think we found the carbon dynamic on the coastal vegetation. I think from previous information, many of scientists found that actually the carbon being stored is mostly under below ground, either into below ground biomass or it is in sediment, and only 20 to 30% they are as the biomass above ground. So this is some information that's very important key, that if you want to measure the 100%, one area of the carbon, so I think it's very important we need to consider that below ground as the mine of carbon storage in our coastal ecosystem. So remote sensing, usually people using remote sensing, so it's already estimate about 20 to 30% of the whole carbon in the one area. But then we need to do some observation to have some cores in order to have the rest 70 or 80% of the carbon in that area. This is some the important aspect coming from that paper published 2019. I think this is telling us about the carbon accumulation rates in the mangrove ecosystem globally. So this is published, yeah, and we found here that among others location in the global, I think so far we found that in Indonesia, especially in Delta Brau, they have the highest of carbon accumulation rates in the mangrove ecosystem. So this information, I think, very good if you really want to consider the importance of the carbon into future trading or financial aspect of the blue carbon ecosystem. So the accumulation rate is one of the important things to improve the bargain or the price of carbon in terms of the area in Indonesia or in other places in global. And this is important data. I think this is we modified from the IORA white paper regarding the blue carbon. So this is blue carbon finance mechanism that I think in general there are two different finance mechanism for blue carbon. One is investment, another is a grant. So for investment, of course, we need some financial return, but for the grant there is no need to repay or return. So there are several options. I think the next speaker will be detailed speak about this, and the combination between investment and grant, there is a blended finance or mix between investment and grant, something like that. And this is nowadays is quite common being implementing in various issues regarding to the natural resources or like a payment for ecosystem services or other things. And when we are thinking about the carbon pricing and non-carbon benefit, I think there are several ways of linking the carbon pricing with the non-carbon benefit. I think there's some terminology like CCB and CD Vista or VCS. VCS is a theory about the only carbon, but CCB is about the climate change, community, and biodiversity benefit. And CD Vista is how to link the carbon pricing with the other goals for SDGs, something like that. So these three linking, I think, quite now will be very important for putting the price of the carbon or other benefit in one area. And also, this is just coming, just published few months ago, still this year. I think the variety of carbon pricing globally. So this data giving information that the carbon pricing is range up to now 2021. The carbon pricing range between $1, less than $1, up to 137. I think 137 is located in Sweden per ton carbon ton CO2 equivalent, and the average of carbon price is about $2.9 US in general, something like that. And this is this map also giving us the information about the geographic carbon pricing in 2021. I think this figure is quite informative, that telling us which country already apply the carbon tax or emission trading system. And on the cycle, I put the Indonesia now Indonesia is under consideration to apply to making under consideration to prepare for the carbon pricing to be applied in Indonesia area, something like that. So we are hoping by this year that regulation about the carbon pricing is signed by the government, so can be implementing directly by early of next year. I think that are my presentation. Thank you very much, Matt, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Andreas. Terima kasih. That was an excellent setting of the scene, outlining not only the nature and benefits of blue carbon, but also how we can start thinking about the blue carbon finance. And so building on that, I would like to now introduce Amy Schmidt. Amy is Manager of Blue Carbon Solutions at VERRA. And VERRA is a name that will be well recognized by many people as a framework for many standards that deal with the validation and verification of not just carbon benefits, but other benefits as well. And Amy also has a research background with a master's from Virginia Commonwealth University and some research experience at the University of Michigan Biological Station. I hope, Amy, I've got that right. And I know it's Amy's based in Washington, DC, and I know it's a late autumn evening there. So thank you for giving up your evening for us, Amy, and please, the floor is now yours.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you to everyone for the opportunity to speak with you today. Let me set up my screen sharing. Okay, so today I'll be talking about blue carbon in the voluntary carbon markets. So to kind of set the stage a little bit, voluntary carbon markets can provide a source of funding to blue carbon activities and other types of activities by enabling projects to issue carbon credits that represent either emission reductions or carbon sequestration. And over the past few years, we've been seeing a real increase in the amount of voluntary carbon credits that have been issued, both under VERRA's verified carbon standard, but also under a number of other voluntary programs. And so we're really seeing a lot of demand for voluntary credits, mostly from companies wanting to make carbon neutrality claims or offsetting claims, but also starting to see some more compliance mechanisms recognizing voluntary carbon programs. And so starting to see some of that compliance carbon programs driving action in the voluntary market as well. And from the VCS program side, we have been seeing, especially since 2018 and 2019, an increase in the number of projects and the number of credits being issued, and also a large increase in the proportion of those credits that are coming from AFLU projects, which stands for agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And this includes blue carbon activities. So not only are we seeing a large increase in the demand for voluntary carbon credits overall, but we're also seeing a large increase for credits from AFLU activities, which are also sometimes called nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. So I'll give a brief overview of kind of what goes into a voluntary greenhouse gas program and what it means to issue a carbon credit, and also the VCS program, or the Verified Carbon Standard program. So the VCS is the world's most widely used voluntary greenhouse gas program, and it enables projects to complete validation and verification in order to issue carbon credits based on their greenhouse gas emission reductions and removals. And so certified projects can issue what we call verified carbon units, or VCUs, which represent 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent of an emission reduction or an emission removal or carbon sequestration. And so the VCS program does this by establishing a standard that projects and methodologies are certified to. So the standard essentially sets out all of the rules and requirements that projects would need to follow in order to generate these high quality carbon credits or VCUs. And it does so by allowing the development of robust accounting methodologies to quantify the greenhouse gas emission reductions or removals, establishing an independent auditing process to have that process to ensure that these credits are real and accurately quantified, and then also having a transparent registry system so that the credits can be tracked once they're issued. So each verified carbon unit or VCU, like I mentioned, represents 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, and it has to meet a number of different principles. So it must represent a real emission reduction or removal, one that's actually occurred, and also an emission reduction or removal that can be measured and quantified. One that is permanent, or that the permanence can be ensured through something like a buffer mechanism in case of carbon stock loss due to something like a forest fire or a flooding event. And the credits must represent emission reductions and removals that are in addition to what would have occurred in a business as usual scenario or in the absence of the incentive provided by the voluntary carbon market. And then each VCU must be independently verified, transparently listed, and have a unique serial number on the registry. And also where the emission reductions and removals cannot be accurately measured, they must be conservatively estimated so that you are not overestimating the benefit that a project is having. And so projects issue these VCUs, which can be bought by companies or individuals who can then use them to make offsetting claims. So to claim that they have offset their carbon emissions or, potentially to reach like a carbon neutrality claim. So under the VCS program, projects need to go through a certain process in order to be developed and issue credits and certify their credits. So first, projects must select an appropriate methodology, so one that's applicable to the activity type that they're doing. They then need to go through a validation process where an independent auditor assesses that the project design has been done in accordance with the methodology and also with the VCS standard. Projects then monitor their project results and the emission reductions that they achieve and go through another type of audit called a verification, where an auditor will go and verify that they have done their math correctly and the emission reductions and removals that they are claiming as VCUs have been correctly quantified and that they've implemented all of their activities correctly. And then finally, projects can register on the VERRA registry and issue carbon credits. So that was a very quick overview of the VCS program. And now I'll switch over to talking a little bit more about blue carbon specifically. So currently under the VCS program, there are 3 ecosystem types that we kind of consider blue carbon and that are currently covered by the program. And these include mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses. And one of the key similarities between all of these ecosystem types is that they are made up of vascular plant systems, and most of the carbon, or a significant amount of the carbon in all of these ecosystems, is stored in the soils. This is especially true for salt marshes and seagrasses. Mangroves also store significant amounts of carbon in their above and below ground woody biomass. And another, before I move on, just another kind of key component of all of these ecosystems is that they're located in tidal or coastal wetlands. So they're either sometimes or all of the time inundated with saltwater. And in terms of the activities that are covered by carbon methodologies with these ecosystems, we have restoration of wetland ecosystems and conservation of intact wetlands, and that can apply to any of those 3 ecosystems that we just went over. So in terms of restoration activities, a lot of times in carbon markets, when we hear restoration, we think of reforestation and afforestation, which is essentially tree planting. And so with wetland ecosystems, I always like to think of this as being similar to that, but with a lot more activities that can be included or that should be included within a project. So restoration activities can include things like creating, restoring, or managing hydrological conditions, altering sediment supply, changing the salinity characteristics of the water, improving water quality, reintroducing or planting native plant communities, and improving management practices. And in terms of successful wetland restoration, many times what we see is that a project may need to do more than one of these activities to ensure kind of long-term success of the ecosystem restoration. And many times that also involves being able to identify what drove the wetland degradation in the first place. So for example, if the hydrological conditions were changed, and let's say that you have a lower tidal flow to an area and that caused mangrove degradation, simply going back and replanting the mangroves isn't going to fully solve that problem. You would need to do kind of mangrove planting along with the restoration of the hydrological conditions that were previously present. Under conservation activities, essentially what this is doing is reducing planned or unplanned wetland conversion or degradation. And so for those of you who may be familiar with terrestrial forest conservation or RED projects, wetland conservation projects follow a very kind of similar process where it's very important to identify and address the drivers of wetland conversion and degradation. So these can be things like coastal development, infrastructure, like port construction, aquaculture, or things like small scale removal of mangroves for charcoal production or something like that. Within wetland ecosystems, the conservation activities could also include things like improving water management on drained wetlands, recharging the sediment to avoid drowning of wetlands, or creating space for wetlands to migrate as sea level rises. So under the VCS program, we have a few different methodologies that are applicable to these types of activities. The first is a methodology for tidal wetland and seagrass restoration. And then tidal wetland restoration and conservation is also included in a RED Plus methodology called the RED Plus methodology framework. And both of these methodologies include what's called a positive list for additionality. So projects simply need to meet a set of conditions and they can demonstrate that they are additional without needing to go through kind of a more traditional additionality assessment that involves like an investment or barriers analysis. So that's intended to kind of streamline the process for project development. And then under the VCS program, projects can also use methodologies that were originally developed under the CDM. So there are a couple of afforestation and reforestation methodologies for mangroves under the CDM, one for large scale and one for small scale activities. So methodologies are kind of the document that sets out exactly how a project will quantify the benefit that they're having. So it will have a set of what are called applicability conditions, which set out what types of projects the methodology can be applied by. It will also set out what's called the project boundary, which includes the physical boundary of the project or the geographic boundary of the project, but also the greenhouse gases that are included in the quantification. So for a blue carbon project, this is things like CO2 and carbon stocks in soils and above and below ground biomass, but it can also include emissions from the soils like methane or nitrous oxide, depending on the characteristics of the site. The methodology will also set out procedures to identify the baseline scenario. So this is what would have happened in the absence of the project activity, and it's what you're kind of comparing the project activity to or against. And we'll set out procedures to demonstrate additionality. So as I mentioned in the previous slides, some methodologies have just kind of a list that projects need to meet certain conditions on, and others set out a process where you can demonstrate like financial additionality to show that the project activity is not the most like financially attractive option. And finally, methodology set out the process for how projects quantify their emission reductions and removals, and also the specific monitoring procedures that need to be followed. Under the VCS, the timing for MRV, or monitoring, reporting, and verification, is flexible. So projects are not required to do this on an annual basis. They can do it kind of when it makes sense for the project to do so. So you can include multiple years of monitored data per verification. And essentially, a project would monitor the data per the methodology to calculate the carbon stock changes or emission reductions, and then go through the verification by an approved independent third-party auditor, and then have review and approval by VERRA before being able to issue carbon credits or VCUs. And so some of the blue carbon specific requirements include things, and so each one will differ a little bit depending on the methodology that's being applied, but some of the monitoring will be to monitor changes in above and below ground biomass carbon stocks, changes in soil carbon stocks, where a project includes fossil fuel use or biomass burning, estimating the emissions from those, and where relevant, also estimating emissions from soils, so CO2, methane, or nitrous oxide. One of the things that is unique to wetland projects is that they need to estimate what's called allochthonous carbon. And so this is carbon that originates outside of the project area and is kind of deposited within the project area. So you can think of this as sediment within water, flowing into a wetland and kind of getting stuck there in the soils or in roots of plants. And so this doesn't represent carbon that was sequestered by the ecosystem. And so in order to have a conservative estimation of the carbon benefit, all projects need to estimate how much of their carbon stock is this allochthonous carbon and deduct it. And then a couple of other things that would need to be monitored are like the area of wetland degradation for a conservation project, and then an estimation of non-permanence risk for the carbon stocks within the project area, including non-permanence due to sea level rise. So sea level rise is something that all coastal wetland projects need to take into account, since, as we all know, sea levels are rising and are predicted to continue to rise. And so the sea level rise could cause wetland degradation or loss of carbon stocks, depending on kind of the system and whether the wetland ecosystem is able to adapt to the amount of sea level rise that occurs, or if the wetland is able to kind of migrate inward or further inland. So projects are required to take this into account, ideally design their project to take into account this wetland migration due to sea level rise, and where wetland migration is not able to occur, kind of predict the estimated impact on the carbon stocks. So for a couple of project examples, so under the VCS program, we don't have a really significant number of blue carbon projects yet, but we do have a few, and we're starting to see a lot of interest and a lot more projects be developed. So one of the projects that I'll highlight here is a mangrove reforestation project in Indonesia and Sumatra. And so this project has been registered and has issued about 40,000 VCUs over the project lifetime so far. And they've done mangrove planting on about 5,000 hectares and have been using one of the CDM afforestation and reforestation methodologies for mangroves as their quantification methodology. Another project that I'll highlight is located in a very different region of the world. It's in Colombia in South America. But this is the first project, the first mangrove conservation project that has been registered and issued credits under the VCS program. So all of the other projects, blue carbon projects that we've had so far have been restoration. So it's exciting to see a conservation project reach this step. And so this project is reducing unplanned mangrove deforestation and so far has issued approximately 60,000 VCUs and is also working with the community in order to kind of reduce the threat on the mangrove ecosystems by implementing things like ecotourism and improved fishing practices within the community. So far we've mostly talked about issuing carbon credits under the VCS program, but at VERRA we do also manage a few additional standards, and some of them can be used by projects to certify their environmental and social safeguards, and then also to add a label, like what's called a label, to a VCU or to a carbon credit. And this basically labels that carbon credit as coming from a project with these additional benefits. So one of these programs is called the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standards, or CCB standards. And this allows projects that have benefits to climate change mitigation, local communities, and biodiversity to certify their benefits to all of those things. And then we also manage another standard called the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, or SD-VISTA, which allows projects to certify their contributions to the SDGs. And projects using both of these standards can add that label to any carbon credits that they issue. And these kind of labeled carbon credits can make the credit more attractive to buyers or help projects get a higher price on their credit when they're selling them to buyers. And the last
2 minutes, Amy, if possible.
Okay, yeah, I think this is my last slide, so I should get there.
Great.
The last thing I'll talk about is under the SD-VISTA standard, projects can certify their contributions to SDGs, add a label to carbon credits, but they can also issue assets or unique types of credits that are associated with a particular sustainable development goal. So one of the first types of these credits that's being developed is a coastal resilience credit. And so this will quantify the coastal resilience benefits of tidal wetland restoration and conservation activities in terms of reduced flooding, or the number of people who are experiencing reduced flooding from these ecosystems. And this is currently under development by the Nature Conservancy with VERRA and with SD-VISTA. And the hope is that it will allow tidal wetland restoration and conservation projects to be able to issue both carbon credits and these coastal resilience credits and access multiple sources of finance to help fund the project activities. And with that, that is the end of my presentation. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Amy, and right on time, and you've managed to cover what is, I find, a complex topic simply and elegantly, as always. And I guess on a personal note, I'll recognize that Amy is always generous in explaining things to me whenever I send her a message saying, help, I don't understand this. So thanks, Amy. All right, on to our next and final speaker before we go to the chat. And by the way, remember that you can post your questions in the Q&A function down the bottom of your screen. We do have a few starting questions. But on to Megan Evans. Megan is a lecturer in the School of Business in the University of New South Wales, where she's into several years, I think, into a 3-year early career fellowship provided by the Australian Research Council. And Megan and I have had a couple of interesting conversations, and so why not, Megan, let's broaden that out to the audience. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt. And yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I hope you can all see that. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country in Canberra. There is a UNSW campus here in Canberra. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm standing on the land of traditional owners and honour their elders past and present, and just recognise that Australia does not yet have a treaty with its First Nations people. And I think that's important just for generally speaking, but also acknowledging that a lot of First Nations and Indigenous people are the communities who are delivering or being asked to deliver some of these carbon credits, blue carbon projects. So with that note, I guess I need to confess something to you, and that is that I'm a social scientist. I don't really know an awful lot about finance at all, to be honest. I don't really know an awful lot about blue carbon other than what the presenters thankfully described just before. I'm mildly scared of the ocean, but I do like to think about how these financial instruments and innovative approaches are going to affect or be affected by people and organisations and communities. So, and I did ask Matt if it was okay, and I'm going to somehow figure out how to change slide, to ask what do we mean by an innovative approach? And I am being a little bit tricky here, but I promise there's method to my madness. When we're talking about an innovative approach to mobilising capital or raising finance, what exactly is innovative about it? So I was kind of going through this thought experiment last night as I was writing these slides. I'm thinking about, okay, what is new? What is innovative about this? Is it the policy instrument itself? And I guess I would argue that economic and financial policy instruments have been around for quite a while. We've been talking about market-based instruments, payments to ecosystem services, which all emerged around late 90s, 2000s. And this is a horrendous slide just to illustrate from a really nice paper, just to kind of show that the way we describe these instruments or these policy tools or whatever you want to call them evolve over time as language evolves. So what started out as was widely discussed in the US as wetland mitigation banking, which actually started in the 70s, but became more of a market-like instrument around the 90s. In the literature, the terminology started out talking about wetlands and mitigation banks, Clean Water Act, because that was context in the US. And over time, it's evolved to include terms like biodiversity, no net loss, economics, incentives, payments, trading. So this is just to say that I guess what is old is new again a lot of the time. What started as wetland mitigation banking, the general kind of principle around that is now more commonly referred to as offsets, or I'm now starting to hear natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions. So the other thing I thought about that could be innovative with some of these approaches are the kinds of partnerships. And in particular, we're starting to see a much greater role for the private sector in environmental governance. And that's also been an ongoing trend in environmental policy and governance. And we've also had a lot of, I guess, innovation in partnerships to do with public-private partnerships and what's called new public management in public administration that came around the 1990s with Tony Blair as the UK Prime Minister at the time. So that in itself, in terms of partnering between public and private sector, isn't new in itself. But what we might be starting to see is novelty in the kinds of roles and responsibilities that different actors take on. And they might be new in different contexts as well. It might be a particular department in a particular state government in a particular country that has never undertaken a public-private partnership before, even though in the transport department, they've been building roads with private sector partnerships, for decades, but in the environment department, they haven't. The other thing that I just wanted to mention, something as desperately boring as a contract or the type of contract can actually be novel. And I mention this because in my time, a bit of time I spent working in government, in state government in Queensland, Australia, we were trialling different kinds of contracts relating to offsets or carbon credits, what have you, as part of this program here called the Land Restoration Fund. And this is, you can read that's kind of part of the election commitment that came around 2017, where, it's a $500 million fund. It was meant to facilitate a pipeline of Queensland-based Australian carbon credit unit projects with the aim to pursue environmental and economic co-benefits. And you might read that and think, well, that's pretty innovative, which it is. But I would argue that probably one of the more innovative things that people don't really quite appreciate is the contracting arrangements with these things. It took us probably 18 months to trial a new style of contract that was for a project that had 3 partners. There was a utilities company, there was a carbon service provider, and there was a state government department. And it was all about delivering carbon credits that had co-benefits. And the contract was payment on delivery. So the actor who was delivering the carbon credits wasn't going to get paid for the trees until they delivered the carbon credits, but they needed upfront investment to plant the trees. So it was this quite complex legal arrangement that, was innovative and useful in that, we're ensuring we're getting an outcome, we're getting a carbon sequestration rather than just paying someone to plant trees, which can result in failure. But, that is actually quite innovative. So I guess this is just to kind of ask the question and ask people to ponder when they hear about innovative approaches, what are we actually referring to? What exactly is new and for whom? And who is responsible for facilitating this transformation? And I mean, I guess, transformation, within organisations, whether it be government or NGOs, or in communities. Who is responsible for facilitating that change? Because, as we know, anytime if any of you get asked to fill out forms or do any kind of admin in their job, anytime a new form comes out, it's just another thing that you need to learn how to do. So organisational and cultural change takes time. The good thing about, going back to my original point, that when we're talking about blue carbon or carbon offsets or natural climate solutions, even though a lot of it is, well, this is kind of a lot of the same thing that we've been talking about for a long time, but we're actually saying is innovative, there's still actually, it's a good thing in a way, because there's actually a lot of scope for us to learn from past experiences. Now, some of the work that I've been doing as part of my fellowship is understanding this narrative and this discussion around unlocking or scaling up or catalysing biodiversity finance. And there's a whole lot of reports that have been coming out. And me and some of my colleagues have been looking at this and trying to count the reports that are coming out and understand what they say. And this is some work that Nadine and Hang are helping me with. But But generally speaking, we haven't quite done a detailed analysis just yet, but generally when you have this discussion, you hear either from an investor perspective that, well, to be able to unlock, we need to unlock this finance and have these capital flowing, we need investable projects. We need projects at scale so that we can invest a lot of money in rather than little drips and drabs where the transaction costs are too high. But we also really need to be able to measure stuff, and biodiversity and carbon are notoriously difficult to measure. So we need standardized metrics is one of the things that comes up. And then from a government perspective, a lot of the time it's, well, governments need to have supportive, aligned policies. So, you know, you can't, for example, on one hand, like in Australia, have a federal policy that pays landholders to protect or plant trees, and then at the state level have laws that kind of facilitate or incentivize clearing of trees. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And ideally, a lot of the time you hear that, well, we need public investment to go into some of these projects to de-risk them for the private sector before the private sector, you know, really wants to put their money anywhere near some of this stuff. What I've noticed, and this is just an observation at the moment, is generally we don't seem to have a lot of discussion, at least in this, a lot of these reports, these glossy reports that are coming out, is what are the needs and issues from the supply side of the equation? And I mean the people and communities who are undertaking some of these carbon projects. And I guess I just want there to be, I guess, a broader appreciation when we talk about the fact that there's a huge funding gap in nature, in protecting the environment, and that we need to mobilize huge amounts of capital to deliver these environmental and climate outcomes. What we're talking about, if all of that capital is to flow, is actually a huge transformation of land use. And you know, decades of social science research shows that when you want to try to ask people to change the way they do things on the ground, financial incentives are not the only thing that changes behaviour. There's a whole lot of other things that might influence whether or not a community or an individual might decide to undertake a project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of case studies, and one is carbon farming in Queensland in Australia. So this map here is a map of the east coast of Australia with Queensland, the state in the north, and New South Wales there as well. And that kind of splodge in the middle there is in Western and Central Queensland and New South Wales, is where the majority of Australian carbon credit units are being generated, at least for vegetation style projects. So this is not blue carbon, but still carbon credits. And this is, you know, bear in mind that this is this is an economic incentive. All of these people or landholders have voluntarily taken up these opportunities to generate carbon credit in exchange for a financial payment. But we need to remember that these projects occur within communities, and a lot of these communities have their own identities, norms, and historical land uses. So the article on the left is the kind of article that I see in the rural press about every 6 months or so about carbon farming in Queensland. Is it killing the community, or is it saving the world? Here's another one, corporate carbon farms locking up the lands, locking out the people. And, you know, as with all these things, there's elements of truth, but I guess what is important is perceptions, whether or not they're exactly true or not, matter, and they influence behaviour. This is some work that a really talented honours student by the name of Dania Jassim did a few years ago while I was still at UQ, and she tried to understand what is actually going on in these communities. And as I said, there's a lot of projects going on in this particular local government area. So I think I'll just go back to this slide here. There's about 47 projects happening in just this one local government area. So I don't know exactly the size, but, big, expansive landscapes, small community though. So it's a lot of land and a lot of area that is now devoted to carbon farming. A couple of the things that Daniel identified is that the benefits from this carbon money is not visible or necessarily materializing to all. And that's a market, right? You have some individuals have chosen to take up that opportunity, others haven't. Others want to take up the opportunity, but the scale of their project wasn't economically viable. But I guess there's also other members of the community who aren't landholders, who might own the local shop, who are seeing a lot of these projects go up. And sometimes, I guess the broader context in a lot of these regional communities is this history of rural decline. We're seeing, rural communities generally get smaller because of just this is marginal agricultural land. So sometimes landholders who take up these opportunities to protect, to stop clearing their vegetation and instead grow trees instead of cows, they're leaving town. They're saying, thank you, taking that money, I'm leaving, because that's what I've been wanting to do anyway, but I haven't had the money. What members of the community see is, well, this is actually, the carbon money is actually causing this loss of my community. So that's fueling some of these perceptions out there. The other key thing that I want to highlight is, this is country that historically, and I mean historically in the last 50, 60 years, where the dominant land use has been raising cattle. And how you raise and maintain pasture in this country is you continuously clear land. You push the mulga. Mulga is the type of tree out there. So, and bear in mind that when after World War II, when the governments wanted to get people on country and start producing, for the economy, they put returning soldiers back on these properties, where a condition of their lease was that they had to maintain productive pasture. So it was their legal requirement as being a landholder was to clear vegetation. 50 years later, they're now, that same government in their eyes is saying, we're going to pay you to not clear those trees. This is within living memory of some of these people in this country. So it's actually quite a dramatic shift in land use that goes kind of quite opposite against the established norms in this community. I'm going to take a little sip of water here. And
while you take your sip of water, Megan, I'll remind you we've got about 3 minutes left to
3 minutes
time for conversation, if possible.
I will whiz through this, Matt. I apologise. This is a case study that is not my own. It's a research that a very talented researcher at my school, Toya Bateha, has been conducting as part of her PhD research. And this is not a blue carbon project. I'm aware that there's talk of potential blue carbon finance in the Indian part of the Sundarbans forest. But Toya has done her work in Bangladesh, where there hasn't been blue carbon or carbon credits done there yet, but there has been a whole range of different projects that I think are useful to inform these discussions if there were to be carbon or blue carbon finance in these areas. So there's been integrated management plans implemented in these communities living adjacent to the Sundarbans in Bangladesh since 2010, which broadly aim to protect the forest, reduce community reliance on harvesting non-timber forest products from the forest by encouraging ecotourism, mangrove plantations, etc. And Toyaba was broadly interested in, well, it doesn't seem that these strategies are working. It seems that the community are still heavily reliant on the forest. Why is that? Why isn't conservation not working? And she's done this work to kind of show that, well, 40 years ago, this community was essentially agrarian. This is agricultural land. And over the last 40 years, 90% of it has been lost or cleared to make way for shrimp farming, which was the land use that I guess the government of Bangladesh thought would help lift communities out of poverty at the time. And she's gathered this incredible data showing that in terms of income, if you're a shrimp farm owner, you're making a heck of a lot more money than someone who's making money out of agriculture or even from non-timber forest products. But there's a lot of inequality, and this shrimp development has actually exacerbated this inequality. I see you there, Matt. Broadly speaking, I think I just want to emphasize that this is a community where there has been a lot of history and a lot of previous efforts to encourage communities to change their land use. So if one were to come into this community now and say, hey, we've got this new thing called blue carbon, we want you to plant some trees in return for X, you might get not necessarily welcomed with open arms, given past experience. So it's really important to bear in mind that to have communities drive these decisions and for it to be bottom up and not top down. So here's my take-home messages, and I'll stop talking now.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks for bringing us home by reminding us that there's a lot more than just the flow of money that we need to consider, but there's the history, and there's the culture, and there's everything that wraps around considerations of how we're working with people. People are at the core of all of this. So I've been a little bit remiss in my moderation, but we've still got a little over 20 minutes for questions, and the questions have been coming in through the Q&A. So I'm going to get through as many as I can. And I'll put my eyes on so that I can see them. I might start with by combining a couple of the questions to Amy. There was some questions, Amy, around who sets the price at which who sets the price at which the credits are purchased for, and then questions sort of similar around certification and the additional benefits. So I might wrap those up in a single question, Amy, around who sets the price, how does that work, and layering over some of the sort of the co-benefits.
Sure. So the price is set between the project developer and the buyer. So it's an agreement between kind of those two parties, and it's something that VERRA actually isn't involved with. So I don't have too many insights I can share on that. But there's, I guess, like a few different things that could go into that. So one is that a project could sell directly to a buyer, or they could go through a broker organization that then sells credits to a buyer. And then also something that I've heard from a few different blue carbon project developers is that there's a very high demand for blue carbon credits right now, which means that they are seeing kind of a higher price in the market than other types of carbon credits. But beyond that, kind of the answer to the question is that it's set between the project and the buyer. And then in terms of layering on additional certifications, these are really intended for projects that want to like certify or demonstrate that they have these additional benefits beyond the climate change mitigation benefit. And so usually we would recommend that a project choose, one additional certification or the other, depending on kind of the specifics of that, to, really show the types of benefits that they're having, and kind of depending on how almost they would want to market the project, of showing that they have benefits to climate, community, and biodiversity, or to demonstrate kind of a contribution to a specific SDG, would help differentiate between them.
Thanks, Amy. And I might stick with you for the next one. While we've got you, it's a question around additionality. I think you more or less answered this one in your presentation, but expanding on it, additionality at the scale of projects, or are there examples at a larger scale? And I guess I'm thinking of the method for tidal wetland introduction, and the two methods that you've got there. And then the question is, do you have some examples where seagrasses have been used?
Sure. So all projects have to demonstrate additionality, but we do have some examples where it's been almost like preset for tidal wetland conservation and restoration. And this was done with a couple of the methodologies that I talked about in my presentation. Basically, an analysis of the area of tidal wetland that had either been degraded or that was at threat, and then comparing that to the area of land that had actually been restored or that was being protected. And it was at such a low percentage, so less than 5%, that there's kind of this overarching additionality demonstration for this class of activities under a couple of methodologies. And then in terms of seagrasses, so this is an area that we're also seeing a lot of interest in, and we have one project that is under development and has started or is about to start the validation stage. So it should be coming through fairly soon, and it's a seagrass restoration project in the United States. But we are seeing a lot of interest in seagrass restoration and conservation in a lot of different areas around the world.
Thank you, Amy. And I see there's questions coming in. Some of them are quite specific, and I might not get to those. So speakers are welcome to type their answers to those live. But I might address Andreas. I might go to you next. There's a series of questions. You gave us a tantalizing piece of information in your talk about the development of a pricing mechanism in Indonesia, and there's a set of questions on that. I think all of them are just seeking a little bit more information, if you can give it, about what that might look like. And is that a price that will apply only within Indonesia, or will it be expanded beyond Indonesia? Is there any more information you can give to the audience online, Andreas? Oh, I haven't got a sound yet, Andreas.
Hello, can you
yes,
hear? Okay,
that's better.
So regarding the carbon pricing in Indonesia at the moment, we are now on processing for establish the national policy regarding carbon pricing, and hopefully by end of this year it can be, it should be signed by the government, hopefully, and will be implemented by next year. So regarding the price of the carbon, also I think Amy already mentioned that is there will be, I don't know, actually the agreement between buyers and then the project manager, and and also thinking where is the position of the government, something like that. So this is also very important for us. Now we are trying to thinking about the benefit of carbon pricing to our national conservation, not only for the terrestrial but also for the coastal environment, something like that. And maybe I can ask the others some question, Matt, regarding the MPA, the current status of the restoration project in Indonesia.
Sure.
Since I think early this 2019, I think we already have a national project for mangrove restoration, as well as another coastal ecosystem like coral reef ecosystem. So for the mangrove restoration project, that I've already mentioned about the target for 600,000 hectares of mangrove restoration in Indonesia, and now still ongoing, especially during this pandemic. I think the government quite put some money on restoration issue for coastal ecosystem, mangrove, as well as the coral reef through the Indonesia Coral Reef Garden Project. So I think this is one of the information, good information for us that the Indonesian government actually is very concerned about the issue of the restoration of the coastal ecosystem to enhance the resilience of the ecosystem itself, but also the community who live nearby the ecosystem. I think that's my comment.
Thank you, Andreas. And now there's two questions I think I might throw to Megan. Megan, one's around community perceptions, and I think you might have been looking at that question about, the question was about raising awareness of carbon farming, but I think you can probably broaden the question around some of the concepts that you started to introduce in your talk. And then there was another question around dealing with the context of small island states and the limited land available for different activities there. So do you want to grapple with those two quite complex questions?
Yeah. Oh yes, I might park the small island state land issue right now, because I would just really be making stuff up, because I wouldn't know how to answer that question. So but maybe I can try to grapple with that a little bit. With the community perceptions, I think it was Jay who was asking the question about that, and it was about recommendations for awareness raising. The issue isn't awareness. The community is fully aware of what's going on, at least in the Queensland case study that I was talking about. It's more so I guess we assume that once people become aware of this opportunity, they will rationally want to take it up, because it's, they're going to make more money by farming carbon rather than cattle. And it's unfortunately not as simple as that. What we've observed in this case study is that a couple of things that could have helped when it probably didn't. When the program first started up, this is a federal government program. So in Australia, we've got 3 levels of government: federal, state, local. And in some of these, really tight-knit rural communities, the further you are away from their community, the less likely you are to be trusted. So anyone who's not in the community is an outsider, and that's just human nature. So at the time, I think around 2014-15, there was a bit of an envoy from the federal Australian government kind of talking about carbon farming and how it's an opportunity. That didn't necessarily kind of get through, because it was outsiders kind of talking about it. So there would have been potentially a better outcome if rather than it coming from the outside coming in, it was hey, there's this potential opportunity, maybe we can work with local organisations, provide some investment to do some community deliberation planning, get an idea of community needs and expectations, rather than it being a purely, we're just going to throw some you know, a carrot here and expect individuals to take up the opportunity. So that's kind of what's happened. Individuals have taken up the opportunity, and now locals are kind of walking around going, what's gone on here? So they're kind of aware of it, but they're aware of it kind of at a point where now it's kind of that the trust has been broken. So yeah, I guess I'll just leave that there. I guess the other thing is that, at least in the carbon market context in Australia, a big thing that came up in that case study was a lack of independent advice. Honest brokers is the term. To be able to do a carbon project, you typically need, because these projects are so complex, you need to enlist the services, the paid services of a carbon service provider to broker that deal for you. So it can be difficult for someone whose business is farming to access independent free advice about whether this is an opportunity that they want to undertake without having to pay a lot of money to do an assessment or whatever.
Yeah, so I think paraphrasing, it's, you know, it's not as simple as just raising awareness. It's about building participation into the whole journey from the beginning of the conversation right through to the end outcome. While I've got you, Megan, there's another challenge that I'm going to throw to you. Some questions that are about valuation, and you know, recalling some of our conversations and the distinction between value and price. Do you want to make some musings on?
Oh no, Matt.
Valuation of.
Should I try to bring in the small island state land use restriction into this as well? Yes, value and price. And maybe I'll answer this with another question and be annoying like that. And, you know, I suppose who pays and who is delivering the value, and where is to whom is the value being distributed? So I guess, as an example, you know, the carbon price in Australia in the domestic market is, I think, around $18 a tonne at the moment. Ideally, that price needs to go up to make it economically viable to start shifting some of those projects that we're seeing in the central western parts of Queensland and New South Wales over to the eastern seaboard, where there's, you know, higher biodiversity value, higher restoration potential, more carbon. That financial price needs to go up to make it economically worthwhile. But then I guess for me, the question is who receives those benefits, and you know, who wins and who loses from that. There's always going to be winners and losers in this equation, and I think we just need to be aware that value and pricing, it's not strictly rational, it's not strictly scientific, this is all highly political as well. So there's always going to be politics when there's values, interests and resources that might conflict or not always be aligned.
I knew that was going to be a tricky one for you.
Sorry, I just kind of riffed for a while.
I'm sorry if I put you on the spot for that one. There's a couple more. I might go back to Amy. There's some quite specific ones, Amy. I don't know how we can wrap some of them up for you, but there's one that's around who can be accredited to do the validation and verification, as well as who does the monitoring. And then Alice in Adelaide is asking quite a specific question around the allochthonous carbon, which you touched on in your talk, but I might see if you can. They're two very different questions, but see how you go in answering those.
Sure. So in terms of being accredited to do an audit of a project, kind of broadly, organizations need to be accredited to the ISO 14065 standard, which is essentially a standard for standards, or to another system specifically for VCS auditing. So I know in the US, for example, there's a certain kind of accreditation body that has specific requirements for auditing groups located in the United States that they can be accredited and approved under. So that's kind of the very specific answer for auditor accreditation. In terms of using remote sensing or monitoring of projects, this is something that at least certain types of remote sensing can be used under the VCS program currently by any project. And if there's kind of like new or emerging technologies, that's something that we're also very interested in, because we know that it can go a long way to hopefully reducing the cost that some projects face for monitoring. So hopefully that does well enough to kind of quickly answer those questions. And in terms of allochthonous carbon, so the specific methodologies will set out the procedures that a project would need to follow to estimate the amount of carbon that's coming from those allochthonous sources. And I believe it includes kind of two different pathways, one that uses more of a default factor, a conservative default factor, and another that allows the use of like peer-reviewed literature or other types of studies that have been done for that estimation. And we have heard that in certain systems and for certain types of activities, especially depending on the source of the information, that the allochthonous carbon stock within the project area can make up a pretty significant amount of the carbon stock that's there. So we have heard that in certain regions or in certain cases that it can make it kind of impractical or not feasible to develop that into a carbon project to get credits, because it would kind of eat into such a high volume of the credits that a project would be able to issue, and then make it not financially feasible. But also, if you have any additional kind of more specific questions on allochthonous carbon, please feel free to reach out to me via email, and I can respond that way as well.
Thanks so much, Amy. And now with 1 minute left, I'll address one last question, which has come in from Tuya Zhu and ANU. Tuya, your question around, is there room to do studies on co-benefits? I think the short answer is yes, and I would encourage you to do so if it's something you're interested in. So with that, I think we've had an excellent conversation over the last 90 minutes. Andreas started setting the scene, reminding us of the importance of blue carbon ecosystems, telling us about the specific importance of mangroves in Indonesia, for example, all of the benefits that they provide, and then setting the scene to think about, you know, how we might finance some of the activities that we'd like to do, such as the restoration and protection. And Amy, in a very simple and elegant way, showed us how that is possible through the specific frameworks that she lives in and works with in VERRA and the VCS and some of those other standards. And then Megan took us home with some thought-provoking questions around, well, what are some of the other considerations that we have to bring into our thinking? It's not all about the flow of money. A lot of it is about thinking about people, putting people at the core, and thinking about how we engage in an effective